When I came to my senses, the sky was in front of me. Someone was shaking and tugging at me. I turned around and recognized Sasai and Nakajima. Those officers had climbed onto the Zero's wing and were pulling me out of the cockpit. Nishizawa's voice broke through the muttering of the gathered crowd. "The car, quick," he shouted. Then he turned on the residents, "Quick, to the operating room. Call the chief surgeon. Quick, you sons of bitches." I couldn't go to the hospital. Not yet, anyway. First of all, I must report to Captain First Rank Sato. We always went to the command post and made a report. The need to give the report stuck in my brain, like a splinter. I raised my right hand, demanding that Sasai and Nishizawa put me down. I whispered, "I have to give a report." "Send me to the command center," Nishizawa bellowed in response to hell with duty. "You can't wait around. We're taking you to the hospital." I stubbornly shouted that I had to give my report. The next moment, Nishizawa stepped forward and took me under his arm. Ote supported me from the left, and the two of them dragged me to the command center. Nishizawa continued to grumble, "Stupid bastard. You don't even know what you look like. You're just crazy." I don't remember how I ended up in front of Captain First Rank Sato, who was looking at me like I was a ghost. I struggled to stand and tried to say something, but then the blackness hit again. I suddenly felt like sleeping again. Just that. Sleep. What am I doing here? And then darkness again. Nishizawa and Ota dragged me into the car next to the command post. Nishizawa kicked the chauffeur out of his seat and took the wheel himself. He drove the car to the hospital quickly, but carefully, trying to avoid any hard jolts. Sasai and Ota sat in the back seat with me and supported me. The senior surgeon was already waiting for me in the operating room. He cut off my tattered flight uniform and immediately began treating the wounds. Through my sleep, I felt horrible jabs of pain every now and then as the doctor cut into my scalp. He pulled two crumpled 2.7mm bullets out of my skull, which he showed me later. I could feel the knife scraping across my skull. I woke up when he was almost done. I looked up at him as he leaned over me. My eyes. And then I remembered my eyes. Suddenly panic gripped me and I screamed my eyes. "Doctor, what's wrong with my eyes?" He replied, "You are seriously injured, and there is nothing more I can do here." He examined my face carefully. "You will have to be sent to Japan, where you will be taken care of by specialists." A premonition of disaster overwhelmed me. I feared for my right eye. I couldn't see anything with it. The thought that I might go blind horrified me. I would be completely useless as a fighter pilot. But I must fly. I just have to get back in the cockpit of a fighter plane. I spent 4 days in the hospital, which dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. Bandages covered my body. The doctor pulled 4 pieces of shrapnel out of me, not counting the bullets that pierced my head. On the 4th day, I felt that I could move my left arm and leg slightly. The muscles were barely contracting, but they were moving. But on the other hand, in the high tropical humidity, the wounds on my head became inflamed and my right eye remained blind. Meanwhile, fighter and bomber sorties to Guadalcanal continued uninterrupted. Every day I heard the roar of the engines as the planes sped down the runway and flew away to the battlefield. The flying fortresses made daily visits to Rabaul. From a great height, they bombed our 2 airfields. Every time enemy bombers approached, I was taken to the shelter with other patients. Every night I was visited by Sasai and Nakajima. They suggested that I return to Japan. Only the cool climate of the homeland and the best specialists could heal my wounds, they insisted. I refused. I became irritable and capricious. I argued that I could be cured here in Rabaul, and there was no reason why I should not be able to fly again in a few weeks. If only I had known. It is difficult to explain my feelings, my reluctance to leave Rabaul. I realize now that I was on the verge of hysteria, because the nightmare of the end of my flying career loomed before me. Besides, there was still the question of honor. I considered it an honor to stay in Rabaul as long as possible. Even if I couldn't fly, I could help the green pilots. I could teach them, prevent them from making mistakes that could cost lives. All these reasons merged into one. My return to Japan meant the final verdict of the qualified ophthalmologist I so feared, and so I refused as best I could. Sasai and Nakajima gave up persuading me. It all came to an end on the morning of August 11th, when Captain First Rank Saito, commander of the Lei Air Regiment, came to my bedside. He spoke to me as kindly as possible, but was absolutely firm. "I know how you feel, but I must consider all available factors. I've ordered you to be sent to Japan on a rotational basis, and there you will be placed in the naval hospital in Yokosuka. You'll fly tomorrow on a transport plane. The surgeon told me that your only hope is the doctors in Yokosuka." He smiled at me. "You're going home, not just for your own sake, but for ours as well, Sakai. We all know that you won't be treated better anywhere than in Japan." He rose to his feet. He stared at me for a few seconds, then bent down and patted my shoulder. "You've done a great job, Sakai. Everyone who has only flown with you is proud to have known you and fought alongside you. When your wounds heal, come back to us," he said affectionately, and left. In the evening, Sasai came to see me. He was visibly tired from his daily sorties to Guadalcanal. I told him that orders had been received to send me home in the next few days. Soon all my friends gathered for a modest farewell party. No one sang or talked loudly, and there were no jokes. We just talked quietly, and mostly about Japan. But the Americans had no intention of letting us say goodbye quietly. We intended to sit quietly for a couple hours, but instead we had to run headlong into the shelters. The other pilots pulled me out of the hospital. I gritted my teeth in shame and bitterness. To be so helpless. Here were the men I had led into battle, and now they were dragging me on their backs, half blind and crippled. I wanted to cry and scream, to tear the bandages off. But all I could do was lie quietly with my eyes tightly shut. Early the next morning I made my way to the pier. There was a barge waiting to take me to a flying boat anchored in the bay. Sasai was coming with me, and the other pilots were also gathered. Sasai shook my hands firmly. "I'm sorry to part with you, Saburo. Much more than you can imagine." Tears ran down my cheeks. I just couldn't hold them back. My throat constricted, and I could only shake his hand in response. Releasing his hands, Sasai unbuckled his belt and handed it to me. I stared at the buckle engraved with the roaring tiger. "Saburo, this belt was handed to me by my father. I have one, my relatives have two more. One of us has already died. I know little of the magical properties of the silver tiger, but I want you to keep this buckle and wear it in memory of me. I hope it will help you return to us." I protested, but in vain. Sasai was undeterred. He put the belt and buckle in my pocket, then shook hands again. "I'll see you again, Saburo. I'm not saying goodbye. We'll meet again, and hopefully very soon." He helped me down into the barge. She immediately ploughed on to the waiting airplane. Nishizawa, Ota, Yonekawa, Hattori, Nakajima, and all my friends were waving at me from the pier. They were shouting for me to come back soon, to fly with them again. But then they all seemed to melt away. I could still see with my left eye no farther than a few feet away. I stood as straight as I could and waved at them with my right hand as they turned into vague, blurry silhouettes. And then I cried like a baby. There were very few passengers in the flying boat. Me, a resident who was to care for me on the trip home, and a few war correspondents. Along the way we stopped for refueling at Truk and Saipan. It had been a very long time since I had last been home. I had no idea what wartime Japan was like, but I was still completely unprepared for what I saw in Yokohama. We landed at the harbour on Saturday evening. There wasn't much point in going to the hospital at night, so I went into town. There I could catch a cab and stop by my uncle, who lived on the west side of Tokyo. The people, they had absolutely no idea what war was really like. I looked in amazement at the bustling crowds, the bright lights and glowing windows. I could not believe what I was hearing with my own ears. Thousands of voices, carefree laughter. Did they have no idea what was really going on in the Pacific Southwest? Before each news bulletin thundered down the street, the radio broadcast the Navy march, and then the announcer jubilantly reported the colossal victories over the Americans in the air battles in the Solomon Islands. I heard an absolutely incredible list of American ships sunk, learned of hundreds of airplanes shot down. Crowds of people on the streets in light and bright summer clothes stopped outside stores and on corners where speakers hung. Each time the announcer reported a new major defeat of the enemy, the crowd cheered and triumphant shouts flew through the streets. The nation was simply intoxicated with false victories. People did not realize that there was a war of annihilation going on. I saw that only some delicacies were rationed in the stores. The weight necessary for ordinary life was sold absolutely freely. I wanted to leave this city quickly. Everything that was happening in Leh and Rabaul was beginning to seem unreal. How could these two completely different worlds exist at the same time? After all, blood and death are only a few hours away, and back home there are only shouts of joy over non-existent victories. I waved my hand to the chauffeur and gave him my uncle's address. We drove through Yokohama and into Tokyo. But after a few minutes a policeman stopped the car and looked out the window, staring at me suspiciously. He was confused by my tattered uniform, stained with blood, and the bandages on my head. "What happened to you?" he asked demandingly. "I have just returned to Japan from the front," I replied sourly. "Really?" exclaimed the policeman. "So you were wounded at the front? Where? Tell me where and how." I sighed. "I am a pilot from Guadalcanal. I was shot down in an air battle." "Guadalcanal." The young policeman's eyes sparkled. "We heard about it on the news, and I know we just yesterday won a crushing victory over the Americans. The radio said our fleet sank 5 cruisers, 10 transports and 10 destroyers. It must have been a sight to behold." This was too much. I said rather sharply, "Sorry, Sergeant, but I'm running late." "Come on and hurry up," I ordered the chauffeur. Many years have passed since the day I first set foot on the threshold of my uncle's house. The house itself hadn't changed a bit. It was as if it had come out of the distant past, 1,000,000 years ago. For a few minutes I stood on the sidewalk, admiring the familiar building, the lights and sounds. A strange sense of peace came over me. The irritation faded, and I opened the door, just as I had when I was a child, and uttered the same words as I had then. "It's me. I've come home." From the kitchen came a surprised "Who's there?" I smiled. It was my aunt. "It's me," I obediently replied. There was silence for a moment. "It's me. Saburo," I shouted joyfully. My uncle's voice boomed throughout the house. "What?" And they all ran into the hallway. For almost a minute they stared at me in silence. Uncle, aunt, my cousin and brother, Hatsuo and Michio. They couldn't utter a word, just stood there with their mouths hanging open. I waited patiently while they examined my bloody uniform and bandages. My uncle's voice suddenly sat down to an intermittent whisper. "Is it really you, Saburo?" I could barely hear what he said. "Is it really Saburo? Or is it a ghost in front of me?" Uncle gingerly stepped forward, as if he was afraid I might melt into thin air. I replied, "No, I'm not a ghost. I'm real. And I'm back home again." It was a real return to life. The battles, the death, the wounds, the crack of machine guns, the frantic turns, the American fighters, the dirty bomb shelters. Everything flew away, became unreal, distant, ghostly. It was as if this world no longer existed, though it still hung heavy on my shoulders, like the ghost my uncle had taken me for. To be home again. To talk to my uncle and aunt, to see Hatsuo and Michio again, to relax. To know for sure that there would be no bombing at night, that no flying fortresses were hovering overhead, that the engines of the Mitchells and Marauders would not roar, no explosions would rumble, no shrapnel would whistle, no machine gun bursts would crackle. It took me a long time to relax and forget. I shook my head more than once, trying to regain my senses. We had a lot to talk about. After all, it had been almost 3 years since I had spent the night together with this family. Hatsuo was no longer the schoolgirl I remembered. I stared at her, trying to convince myself that this beautiful young woman was really my cousin. Michio, the bully boy who had been in elementary school, had now moved on to high school, transforming into a nondescript young man. I continued to stare at Hatsuo, trying to catch all the changes that had happened to her over the years. I stayed the night at their house. It was the first night in many years that I enjoyed a deep and restful sleep. Even my wounds, which had prevented me from sleeping for the past week, didn't bother me tonight. The next morning I took the train to Yokohama. The ordinary life of the people in this city seemed even more amazing to me than the night before. The passengers, especially the young girls and women, immediately stared at me. They were squeamish and turned away hastily. They purposely tried not to look at the bloody bandages, and it made me nervous and angry. I was no longer Lay and Rabal's best ace. The man Captain First Rank Sate had asked to return, the pilot respected by all the other pilots. I was bloody, dirty and pathetic in appearance. I was simply despised. As soon as I arrived at the hospital in Yokosuka, an orderly immediately took me to the chief surgeon's office. I was puzzled because it was Sunday. On such days, barring very special occasions, the chief surgeon is simply absent. And he surprised me by meeting me in person. The doctor grinned, seeing my confusion, and explained, "I left orders to notify me immediately as soon as you show up. I have just arrived from home. You see, I received a special letter from Captain First Rank Saito of Lay. He asks me to do what I can for you." He looked at me carefully. "Captain First Rank Saito took the trouble to tell me what you did in the Pacific. I understand you are our best ace fighter." I nodded. "I fully understand your commander's concerns. Come on in, we'll start work immediately." A few minutes later, I was lying on the operating table. The surgeon was scraping pus from my head wounds. He worked quickly and carefully, not caring that I was twitching from the touch of the scalpel scraping across my skull. When he had cleaned the wounds and placed 14 new stitches, he personally took me to the ophthalmologist's. The surgeon explained we called the best specialist in Japan to examine you. Doctor. Sakano was drafted into the Navy after private practice and now holds the rank of lieutenant captain. He is the best eye surgeon in our country. When we received Captain First Rank Saito's letter, we immediately informed Dr. Sakano that we would call on him upon your arrival. So the fateful moment for me has arrived. I would soon find out what the verdict would be, whether I would see again, and whether I would be able to take to the air. I tried to think of anything but my eyes. I didn't want to think about them, but I couldn't. The doctor examined me carefully. He stood motionless for a few minutes and only then spoke. His face was serious, and he spoke very slowly. "We cannot wait a moment. I must operate on your eyes at once. Listen to me carefully. Your sight will depend on what I manage to do in the next hour." He paused. "Sakai, I will not be able to administer the anesthetic. If you want to see, if you wish for me to save at least one eye, you must prepare to endure the pain while fully conscious." I was shocked, so I obediently nodded, not daring to open my mouth. They laid me on a high bed. Several orderlies tied me down with straps and ropes. I couldn't move an arm or a leg. A bandage across my forehead held my head, and a nurse squeezed my temples to make the grip more secure. The doctor ordered me to stare at a red lamp hanging from the ceiling. He warned, "Look at her, Sakai. Keep your eyes on it. Don't take your eyes off that lamp. You must not blink, you must not look away. Listen to me carefully. You may go blind for life if you don't follow my instructions exactly." It was terrible. Much more terrible than it was then. It was the worst pain I'd ever had to endure. I had always believed that I could endure great pain. The code of Bushido taught me patience, self-control in the most dire circumstances. But this, I was forced to stare at the lamp, stared until the red bulb filled all around me. Then the doctor's hand appeared in my field of vision, trembling and unreal, with sharp, sharpened steel in its fingers, which came nearer, 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 nearer. I shrieked. More than once I had screamed like a madman in terrible agony. I felt that a little more and I would not be able to stand it. But nothing happened, and the pain eventually subsided. My desire to fly again, my desire to see, meant nothing now. The pain. One day I yelled at Sakano, "Stop it, stop it. Rip it out completely, just stop it, I tried to pull my head away from the scalpel. I tried to break free from my restraints. However, they held me too tightly. Every time I moaned, the doctor yelled at me, "Stop it. You have to endure it. Otherwise you will remain blind. Stop moaning." The torture lasted more than 30 minutes, but they stretched out for me like a million years. It seemed to me that the suffering would never end. And when it was over, I was so weak I couldn't move a finger. I lay in bed, gasping for air, helpless as a child. It was only when the senior surgeon bent over me, trying to make me comfortable, that I groaned. For a month I was confined to a hospital bed. I felt disgusting. Life no longer meant anything to me. Day and night I remembered the long flight back to Rabaul, and each time it ended the same way. I pushed the control stick forward and crashed into the ocean, for that would only mean a momentary bout of pain. Doctor. Sakano visited me often to check my eyes. He explained, "I did everything I could, but your right eye will never see normally. You will be able to see objects a foot or two away, and no more. But your left eye will be perfectly fine." Those words struck me like a thunderbolt. In fact, it was a death sentence. A one-eyed fighter pilot. I laughed hysterically, and the doctor hurried away. The wounds on my head healed quickly, and the doctors allowed me to walk around the hospital. Every week I petitioned to be reinstated and sent to Rabaul, and every week the request was rejected. Finally, the senior surgeon personally returned the last petition. He was visibly angry. "I must tell you, Sakai, that it will be many more months before you can even dream of returning to Rabaul. My orders are quite clear. You will need at least 6 months to recover from your wounds before you will be returned to active duty here or in the overseas theatre." I felt like a fugitive, a deserter from the front. I thought of all the pilots, Nishizawa, Ota, Sasai, who every day on their Zeros go into another battle. I dreaded listening to the news from the fronts on the radio. They reminded me too painfully of Rabaul. One day I had visitors. The nurse came into the room and said, "You have visitors, they're waiting downstairs. Will you let them come in?" I had no idea who it could be. Today was Thursday, and my cousin Hatsu came to see me and brought flowers at the end of every week, when she could get off work at her munitions factory. I wrote to my mother to tell her not to make the long trip from Kyushu, because I was to be transferred to a hospital in Seispo in a couple of weeks. Yokosuka was separated from Fuka in northern Kyushu by nearly 700 miles by railroad. Mother was now living in Fukuoka with her daughter and son-in-law. But these visitors I was not expecting at all. 2 people entered the room. I strained, trying to recognize them. But I still couldn't distinguish faces at a distance of more than 6 or 7 feet. "Fujiko-san," I said her name. Standing at the door was Fujiko, even more beautiful than the last time we met. Along with her was her father, Professor Niori. I hadn't seen her in 18 months since our meeting in Osaka. They bowed to me and I returned their greeting. We continued to be silent. The nurse offered them chairs and went out. Then her father spoke. "Hatsuo-san wrote to us that you were lying in this hospital. We were so worried about you, Saburo-san. We are greatly relieved to see you, as we feared greatly for your health. It is simply marvelous, for you are looking much better than we thought you would." I mumbled something in reply. The apology was inarticulate and confused, for Fujiko had written to me often when I was in Leh, and the mail had brought me many gifts from her. But her father waved his hand, brushing aside all objections. "It is of no consequence. We are all well aware of your marvelous deeds at the front, and we are proud of you. Now tell me, how are your wounds? Will you recover from them soon?" I replied, "I received 4 wounds. The doctors have done real miracles. Except for one." I bitterly pointed to my right eye. "I am blind in that eye, and the doctors say it is for the rest of my life." My answer horrified Fujiko. She brought her hands up to her mouth, her eyes going wide when she heard my words. "It's true. It's the gist of it," I emphasized. "There can be no other outcome. I have become an invalid. The loss of my eye means the end of my career as a fighter pilot." Professor Niori interrupted me, "But in that case you should be discharged from the Navy, shouldn't you?" No, I don't think so," I replied as sarcastically as possible. Here at home, you just don't realize the full scope of the war we're fighting. But I don't think I can blame you for that. The Navy will find a use for me as an instructor. Maybe they'll pick me up some command position on land. There was a brief pause. Only now did I realize that these people had traveled over 500 miles from Tokushima just to see me, to support me, and to cheer me up. I had behaved shamefully, and after realizing this, I began to thank them for their kindness. Fujiko shook her head. She was disturbed by the dry politeness in my voice. She tried to say something, but her throat constricted and she fell silent. Finally, she turned to the older man and sobbed, "Daddy." There was a mute plea in her eyes. Professor Niori nodded slowly and coughed. "When are you thinking of going back to the Navy again?" he asked, looking me straight in the eye. "I think we should hurry up with the wedding preparations. Of course, if you agree, Saburo-san." What? I choked up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The wedding preparations. I felt dizzy. "I'm sorry, did I understand you correctly?" I asked back. "I'm sorry, Saburo-san," he replied. "I realize it's awkward to put the question that way. Allow me to put it another way." He rose to his feet and asked in the utmost seriousness, "Saburo-san, do you agree to take my daughter Fujiko as your wife? We have done our best to raise her to be a worthy woman. We have taught her everything she needs to know. I would be extremely happy if you would accept my proposal so that I could call you my son-in-law." I was simply taken aback. His words sounded like heavenly bells. Fujiko looked at me with wide-open, glittering eyes, then lowered her gaze. I tore my gaze away from her and stared at the wall. The bitter irony of it all. How many days had I been staring at that very wall in despair? Finally, I pulled myself together. I could barely speak, and the words were literally stuck in my throat. I had to push them out. I hated myself for what I had to say, but I had no other way. "Professor Niori, I'm extremely honored to hear your words. It's just a blessing, but..." I choked and blinked back tears. "But I can't. I can't accept your offer." "That's it," it said. I said the words. What his voice trailed off. "Are you not already married to someone else?" "No, of course not. I had no such thought, I beg your pardon. I must decline, but for an entirely different reason. Professor Niori, I simply cannot say yes, it's impossible. Look at me. Look at me. I don't deserve Fujiko-san. Look at my eyes. I've already screamed. I'm half blind after all." There was a visible look of relief on his face. "Oh my God, Saburo-san, you're humiliating yourself unnecessarily. Don't think you've gotten worse because you were wounded. Your wounds are honorable. They in no way dishonor you. Do you understand what I'm saying? All Japan admires you. People pray to you. Don't you realize that you are our country's greatest ace and a national hero? Professor Niori, there is no way you can understand me. I'm telling you the plain truth, and you just don't hear me." I insisted. "I do not engage in self-deprecation. A hero is always transient. He's like a one-day butterfly. I'm not a hero. I'm a pilot who can't fly. I'm a half-blind pilot. That's what I am. What good am I to the future? Yes, I'm a hero. But you know very well that in our country an individual cannot be a hero." He was silent for a while, and then he continued, "Perhaps I have put it wrong, Saburo-san. But our decision was not made hastily and suddenly. My wife and I discussed everything right after our first meeting. I understand your feelings, but you must understand something too. My wife, myself and Fujiko believe that you are the only man who can make her happy, and we believe that our daughter will do the same for you." I felt my heart breaking. Did this noble and intelligent man not realize what I was getting at? How can you judge a man by a meeting? I shrieked. How can you make a decision knowing me so little? Fujiko-san's whole life, her happiness, her future, you are ready to tie it to me in an instant. I do not understand you, though never in my life have I heard a proposal more noble and honorable than this. I clasped my hands in despair. After all, there are many other young men who are far better suited for Fujiko-san than I am. Thousands of young men. They have excellent educations, brilliant futures awaiting them. What can I offer your daughter, Professor Niori? What can I give her? I beg you, look on the bright side. Look at me. What future awaits me? Fujiko couldn't stay silent any longer. She raised her head and looked directly at me. I felt like jumping out of the room. She said quietly, "You're wrong, Saburo-san." "Oh, how wrong you are. You put too much importance on the lost eye. Whether you are blind in one eye or not is irrelevant to me. We'll live as one person. Whatever lies ahead for any man awaits you." "If it is necessary, Saburo-san, only if it is necessary, I will help. But I'm not going to marry you just because of your screwed-up eyesight." I replied, "You are mistaken, Fujiko-san. I know you're a brave girl, and what you say about yourself is pure truth. But you cannot determine your whole future life by giving in to a momentary emotion." No, she shook her head vigorously. "How can you misunderstand me to that extent? This is not a transient infatuation. Don't you realize that I have been waiting many months for this meeting? I know what I am saying." There was no point in continuing this conversation any farther. I feared that I might break down at any moment. "Professor Niori and Fujiko-san," I said, putting as much firmness into my voice as I could. "I'm not trying to humiliate you in any way. And this is not an attempt to bargain. I repeat that today you have honored me in ways I never dared to expect, but I cannot accept your honorable offer. I refuse to let my feelings override my reason. I have always been a proud man. I cannot marry Fujiko-san. I can't be the husband of such a girl. I'm not worthy of such a high honor. I don't deserve it. It is for this reason that I am forced to say no." I refused to listen to the professor's words. He begged me, but I could only repeat what I had already said, repeat it once more. Soon Fujiko couldn't take it anymore. She fell on her father's shoulder and sobbed loudly. I was ready to kill myself for what I had done. I felt so sorry for her. But I knew that I was doing the right thing, though cruel, and that I was doing it for her own good. Marrying me might bring her temporary happiness, but later Fujiko would be doomed to suffer for years. After about an hour, they left my room. I don't know how long I stood in the doorway after they left. Then I turned around and collapsed on my bed, completely exhausted. It was the hardest hour of my life. But what else could I do? Thousands of times I had asked myself that question, and thousands of times I got the same answer. There was no other way out, but that didn't make me feel any better. I pushed away the most beautiful man I'd ever met. 2 days later, Hatsuo arrived for her weekly visit. She didn't greet me with her usual smile, and didn't even try to hide her displeasure. "How could you do that, Saburo?" she asked, taking a seat at my bedside. "How dare you hurt Fujiko so badly?" Hatsuo said that Fujiko sobbed inconsolably when she met Hatsuo in Tokyo after returning from the hospital. Professor Nari asked my uncle and Hatsuo to do their best to get me to change my mind. Hatsuo looked at me angrily. "They say, Saburo, that you did that because they were upset when they learned of your injury. Father and I have known this family for a long time. They are wonderful people. Why did you do that?" she cried. "Hatsuo, please try to understand me. We've lived together as children for several years, and I suppose you know me well too. As much as it pains me to listen to you, there's no way I'm going to change my mind. I honestly think I am doing this for Fujiko's good, for her happiness." She immediately objected. "They say you refused because you were hurt." "You shouldn't say that." "That is only one of the reasons. I immediately fell deeply in love with Fujiko after the first time we met. My feelings have not cooled in the slightest, and I still love her deeply today. All those long months in Lei and Rabaul, Fujiko was the woman of my dreams. Can't you understand that? I refused because I love her." "You're just crazy, Saburo." "Then hear me out. All the time I was at the front, all those long tedious months, I remembered her every minute. I wanted to make her proud of me, and I achieved that. It's probably not the nicest thing to discuss with you, but I have to be honest. Rabaul is a large military base, with a garrison of over 10,000 soldiers at all times. In addition, an additional infantry division was often stationed there. And what do you think men do when they are far from home, far from their women? In Rabaul we had brothels, as they have here in Yokosuka. When we went back to Rabaul on vacation, some of our pilots just wouldn't get out of those brothels. Not all of them, but a lot of them. But I never did that. My pride wouldn't let me. I wanted to stay as pure as Fujiko on the day I would ask her to be my wife. Before my injury, I could return to her as Sakai, a great ace, a fearless pilot, a man deserving of her hand. But now, no, I've already yelled at Hatsu. I don't want to be pitied. Do you really think I'd let Fujiko pity me? Never. Do you understand me now? Hatsuo squeezed my hand tightly and nodded. I know, was all she whispered. Then she looked me straight in the eyes. And I also know, Saburo, that you are far better than even you can imagine yourself. I know how much you want to fly. And yet I can't stop feeling sorry for Fujiko. It's what's best for her. She. But Hatsuo interrupted me, wrapping her arms around my neck and pressing herself tightly against me. Poor Saburo. You have to hope. You must have faith. You will fly again. I know you will. In October, I was transferred to the Naval Hospital in Sasebo. The change of scenery made me very happy. Now I was closer to home and could see my family. By this time, the summer rains were over and the train ride was quite pleasant. I opened the windows wide and enjoyed the sunshine and the refreshing warm fall breeze. Japan was as beautiful as ever. The mountains and hills painted in autumn colours, the fields and forests were like a wonderful magical land. Trees and bushes burned like crimson fires. Yellow and orange sparks flashed in their flames against the green-brown background of the surrounding landscape. 3 hours after leaving Yokohama, Fujiyama showed itself. I never tired of admiring this most beautiful of mountains. Its slopes curved gracefully to the top of the cone, which still had no snow on it. However, half hidden by the swirling fog, it glistened brightly in the sun. Fuji-san. She reminded me of Fujiko, who was indeed named after the sacred mountain, but who was just as far away from me now. Everything around me was awash in peace and quiet. There was no war raging here, raging somewhere very far away from these clean and manicured farms and fields. What war? I saw only what I had always seen, though the landscape seemed more beautiful now than it had in my youth. I had learned to see more deeply. I could compare the serenity and quiet dignity of the Japanese villages with the frenzied anger of the volcano at Rabaul, with the sandy strip of the airfield at Leh crawling straight out of the jungle. No wonder I felt with my whole being the peace and tranquility that flowed from my native land. I looked at these people, children, farmers, young and old, letter carriers, policemen, merchants, and thought that none of them had ever had the privilege of flying over Guadalcanal at 20,000 feet and looking down on a vast ocean full of strange and terrible life, on long rows of American warships and transports. And there were many more of them lurking over the horizon than I had time to see. In this respect, too, my outlook changed. In Rabaul it became clear that our pilots of the Leh Air Regiment were simply unique. It was impossible for any other naval aviation unit to repeat our incredible victories. There was no need to talk about the Army. Army pilots lacked the combativeness and the highest training that we had. That's why they often fell victim to enemy planes. However, I myself was no longer untouchable either. It was the enemy's turn, and it was only through incredible luck that I was now on the train to Sasebo. A man looks at war in a completely different way after the doctors have scraped the torn skin from his skull, pulled the jagged steel shards out of his body, bandaged him up, and tried to reassure him with the duty phrase, "It's not that bad, Sakai. You're only half blind. Only half blind." My mother waited for the train at Fukuoka station. We only stopped for a few minutes, and this train was not taking passengers. I leaned out the window as far as I could and waved my arms desperately to get her attention. The joy on her face when she saw me was the greatest reward I'd seen in years. She had aged, oh, how she had aged, since her sons had gone off to war. I shouted to her, "I'm all right." "It's all right, Mummy. Don't worry. It's all right now." The train moved again. She stood on the edge of the platform and her eyes began to fill with tears. Still, she waved the rising sun flag, shouting Banzai. Banzai as the train carried me away. The doctors in Sasebo ordered me to spend another month in the hospital. I no longer argued with them to send me to Rabaul. I felt dead tired and empty, and I no longer cared what orders would come tomorrow. The month dragged on tediously long. But the first week was brightened by the arrival of my mother. She was still so kind and caring. Convinced that I still wanted my favorite childhood treats, she baked a whole basket of them, which she brought with her. I was dreading the moment when I would have to confess that I was blind in my right eye. To my surprise, she was not at all disturbed by the news. Mum calmly said, "That doesn't make you any worse, son." And the matter was closed. She offered to come every weekend. It would have been wonderful to see her so often, but I asked her not to do that. She was already old, and the tedious railroad travel was too much for her. The trains ran worse and worse. Military cargoes were taking up more and more space, and passengers were forced to huddle in some nooks and crannies. In November, an event occurred that under other circumstances would have been one of the greatest moments of my life, but now it meant little. At the hospital I received an order to be promoted to the rank of warrant officer. The long climb up the ranks from a matroon recruit who had obeyed brutal discipline and been subjected to endless punishments was over. Step by step I had passed from one rank to another, and now I was rewarded. It was a bitter victory, but it had paid off nonetheless. My new status meant that I could finish my recovery at home. I got the doctor's approval and went straight to the suburb of Fukuoka, where I met up with my family. The next month was absolutely wonderful. For the first time in 10 years, I spent 30 consecutive days with my mother, and she was happy beyond measure. Everything was quiet and peaceful. Almost every day my mother asked, "When do you think, Saburo? When will the war end?" I knew at that moment she was thinking of my 2 brothers who were serving across the sea. And every time she asked, I was forced to tell the truth I didn't know. Then she would anxiously look around to make sure no one was eavesdropping and ask in a whisper, "Saburo, tell me, are we really winning? Are we being told the truth or not again?" I could only repeat that we must win. Still, she was happy. I knew she was passionate that my recovery would drag on indefinitely. A few weeks after I had settled into my sister's house, I received a visitor from Tokyo. He was a correspondent of the Yomiuri Shimbun, a major Japanese newspaper. He told me that the editor had sent him to interview the best Japanese ace. The whole country wanted to read my account of the war. I doubted whether I could speak freely to him. Disciplinary punishment would be swift and severe if I said anything unnecessary. So I called the Sasebo commandant's office and explained my problem. The answer was surprisingly evasive. They said there were no special rules and restrictions. The officer said, "I have no right to forbid you to speak to the reporter, but I must remind you that you will be speaking in your own name, and therefore you will have to answer for everything you say. Also remember that you can neither praise nor censure any officer. Be careful." This was in fact a prohibition. I went back to my room and told the correspondent that my superiors did not approve of the idea of this interview. But he was not so easily dissuaded. The correspondent insisted, "I don't intend to bore you at all, and yet I travelled 700 miles from Tokyo just to talk to you. Please answer a few of my questions. Please. Just give me just 5 minutes." If only I'd known what a fool I'd turn out to be. His ability to twist and turn any phrase inside out was amazing. 5 minutes immediately turned into 3 days. Every morning he would come to my house and write. I had never seen such persistence and ingenuity. He forced me to talk about literally everything. His questions did not concern the war until I realized that the accounts of my affairs and thoughts were in fact accounts of the war. Pretty soon it became clear that I had lost all optimism. That the Marine pilots at Rabaul, despite their many victories, were exhausted in the difficult battle for Guadalcanal, receiving absolutely no help from the Army's fighters and bombers. "We need more fighters and more experienced pilots," I told him, starting to get angry. "Every Zero fighter should be recalled from the front and sent for overhaul after 150 hours in the air. I'm not talking about combat damage. Even if the airplane doesn't fire a single shot and no one fires on it, it will still need repairs. And we can't afford that. We consider a Zero to be in excellent condition if it's only a little poked through and repairs are only done after 200 hours of flying time. Do you realize what it means for a pilot to go into combat in an airplane that can hardly obey the control knobs? Only the very best pilots can fight in such machines and stay alive. If the new pilots we send to overseas theatres are not up to the standards by which we have been trained, then may the gods help them. The American carrier pilots I met over Guadalcanal fight the best, and their tactics are excellent. Their airplanes are constantly improving. The reporter was more than satisfied. He could not hide his joy when he thanked me. But later I found out that I had made only one mistake, but a very rude one. I had spoken to him at all. A week later I returned to Sesbo Hospital and immediately filled out the paperwork for the medical board that would decide whether I could return to action. Finally, I was put to bed for a few days for a full examination. The very next day, however, I was called to the Sesbo Commandant's office early in the morning. The chief of personnel, with a face as red as a tomato, was yelling in a way that made the roof bulge. "Warrant Officer Sakai, you're a complete idiot. I just received a telegram from the Navy Ministry. Everyone there is shocked by the interview you gave to the Yomiuri Shimbun reporter. Are you crazy to start talking like that?" "Now listen to me, Sakai. I've received a severe reprimand from Tokyo for loosening my control over my subordinates. I won't tolerate such foolishness any longer. I'm ordering you not to say a single word about your combat duties without first checking with the press officer. Do you understand? If you ever repeat any of the nonsense you've already said, you will be court-martialed, and I'll go with you. And no one, and nothing will save us." I understood everything perfectly well. I was simply being gagged, but I understood my superior's position. The easiest solution to the problem was to shut Sakai's mouth. I walked back to the hospital, contemplating the reprimand I had been given. Suddenly someone called my name. The orderly knocked quietly on the door to get my attention. I asked incredulously, "What is it?" "Trumping," he replied. "You have a visitor. A tall naval aviator is waiting for you in the visitor's room. He says his name is Nishizawa." "What, Nishizawa? Is that really him?" I shrieked. I immediately forgot all that had recently happened, and like a madman rushed out of my room, nearly knocking down the resident. I opened the door of the visitor's room with a jerk and froze. A tall, thin man was walking slowly around the room with a cigarette in his mouth. It was really him. Moreover, he hadn't changed in the slightest. Nishizawa looked at me, smiling widely, and shouted, "Sakai," I called back. Nishizawa. The next second we were slapping each other on the backs, beyond happy. I pulled my friend away at an outstretched arm. "Let me admire you. You look marvellous. No injuries?" I hurriedly asked. He eagerly confirmed, "None, Saburo. I left Rabaul in November. Not a single scratch. I don't think a bullet has been cast for me yet." I trailed off in delight. "Yes, we named you quite correctly. You really do have your own guardian devil if you made it through Leh and Rabaul without a single mark. Nishizawa, you have no idea how happy I am to see you. Tell me, what's been going on since I left? You must be the best ace in the fleet by now. Oh, I can imagine what you were doing over Guadalcanal." He waved his hands protestingly. "You're attributing too much to me, Saburo. I don't even know exactly how many I shot down. Something like 50, give or take. But I'm still noticeably behind you." He smiled. "You probably don't realize it, but you're still the best of our pilots." I countered, "You sound like a complete moron, old boy. I've seen you in flight many times. I'm afraid you've actually been Japan's best ace for a long time, Nishizawa. All right, tell me, how did you end up in Sesbo?" He replied, visibly gloomy, "They sent me home to the Yokosuka Air Regiment as an instructor." Imagine that, making me an instructor. Saburo, can you imagine me running around a canvas old biplane and showing young idiots how to do a barrel roll and a turn? and how to keep my pants dry. That's me. I laughed. He was absolutely right. The Nishizawa instructor was a real piece of work. And he continued, well, okay, I put up with it for a while. But then I volunteered for the front, as soon as the opportunity arose. And I got my orders this morning. They're sending me to the Philippines. That's why I came here today to see you. We leave tomorrow morning. So soon. Nishizawa remarked, that's exactly what I wanted, Saburo. Flying around Yokosuka is beyond me. I want to get a fighter again. I'm just raring to go into combat. If I stay in Japan, I'll probably die. I understood how he felt. I understood it all perfectly. But old friends had more to talk about. I envy you, Nishizawa. But come on, tell me what was going on in Rabaul. I want to know everything. Where is Lieutenant Sasai now? And Ota, did he come with you? What about my wingmen, Yomakawa and Hattori? Tell me quickly about them. What? He stared at me, deathly pale. Now Nishizawa was looking at me with horror and despair. Didn't they tell you? They didn't tell me what? He spread his hands uncertainly. What's the matter with you, Nishizawa? Weren't they sent home with you? He turned away, lowering his head. His voice trembled. Saburo, he covered his face with his hands, then turned sharply. ... they're dead. I couldn't believe it. That's impossible. What are you saying? I interjected. They're all dead. You and I, Saburo, you and I. That's all that's left alive. That couldn't be true. My legs buckled. I grabbed onto the table to keep from falling and tried in vain to comprehend what had been said. Nishizawa began speaking again, LT. Sasai was the first. On August 26th, we flew to Guadalcanal. It wasn't at all like you remember, Saburo. I don't know how many wildcats were there. But they flew from the sun's side in an endless column. We didn't stand a chance. Our formation fell apart immediately. We had to scramble in different directions so no one saw Sasai's plane hit. We thought maybe he was wounded and flew back before us. But when we got back to Rabaul, he was gone. He never came back. Nishizawa sighed heavily. Then it was Ota's turn. Just a week later. Every time we took off, we lost more airplanes. Guadalcanal was under complete enemy control. Ota died just as Sasai had. No one saw him get shot down. He just didn't go back. Then, 3 or 4 days later, Yonakawa and Hattori were shot down. Both died on the same day. In total, Captain First Rank Saito, Captain Second Rank Nakajima, and less than 6 pilots from the original group of 80 pilots returned with me. I was simply crushed. Nishizawa was silent, waiting for me to speak. It seemed unreal. How could they all be dead? 4 of my best friends. All of them had died while I lay helpless in the Yokosuka hospital. Now I realized why I hadn't learned of their deaths sooner. Nishizawa and Nakajima had made sure that the news wouldn't come to me until my eyes had healed after the operation. Their faces swam in front of me. I remembered Ota laughing merrily, sitting in the cockpit as we wrote loops over Port Moresby. Yonakawa and Hattori, who always had a firm grip on my tail, ready to cover me at any second, to save me from death. Sasai, him. And all of them. Dead. I sobbed loudly in my voice, not the least bit ashamed, like a child. My body shook. I couldn't stop. Nishizawa squeezed my hand, trying to calm me down. Saburo, please, he begged. Please stop. I looked at him. I must be cursed, he hissed. I didn't see Ota and Sasai get hit. I don't know how they died. Our best friends, Saburo, our best friends, and there was nothing I could do to help them. Like a fucking idiot. I was chasing other airplanes. When they died, he choked out. Then Nishizawa sat up again. No, I wasn't. I wouldn't have done anything anyway. There were too many enemy planes around, too many, and he fell silent. We sat looking at each other in silence for a long time. What was there to say? I left the hospital in Sasebo at the very end of January 1943. The long months of treatment were over. I arrived at my first unit, the Hainan Fighter Regiment of the 11th Air Force, which was now based at Toyohashi in central Japan. I was first in this air regiment during its formation in September 1941 at Hainan on Formosa. Of the 150 pilots who left Hainan during the Great Japanese Offensive across the High Ocean, less than 20 survived. These veterans formed the core of the new regiment, but most of the pilots were green rookies who had been trained in an abbreviated program at Tsuura and other flight schools. Captain Second Rank Hadashi Nakajima personally met me when I arrived at Toyohashi. Neither he nor I had any idea that we would meet here and not at Rabaul. I was very lucky to have Nakajima as my commander again. He didn't pay any attention to the chatter that I couldn't fly, and the next day I was back in the air, and on a flying fortress. It was the same bomber that the army had captured in Bandung, Java, in March 1942. All the pilots in my unit flew this airplane. We experienced a real shock, taking to the air in a huge bomber, which amazed us with its exceptional controllability and the complexity and perfection of its equipment. I had never seen anything like it on any of the Japanese airplanes. The next day I returned to my first love, the Zero. I can never convey the feeling of elation that swept over me as I took that little fighter up into the sky again. It obeyed every movement of my hand, literally becoming a part of my body. I tried all aerobatics, put the Zero on the tail, dive, glide on the wing. Flying just intoxicated me. Having received an officer's rank, I got acquainted with a completely different picture of the war. Private and sergeants did not have access to the secret battle reports, which the Fleet Command distributed among the officers. A few days after my arrival at Toyohashi, Nakajima silently showed me a report that we had left Guadalcanal on February 7th, 1943, exactly 6 months after the Americans had landed. Announcers on the radio crackled about the strategic withdrawal, the consolidation of defensive lines, but the secret summary said clearly we suffered a heavy defeat and suffered heavy losses. In the brutal battles with the enemy were destroyed 2 full infantry divisions. The fleet suffered even more terrible losses. On the muddy seabed around Guadalcanal now rusted hulls of 2 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 8 submarines. Naval aviation was missing several hundred airplanes, not to mention select fighter pilots and bomber crews. What happened to us? We swept across the Pacific with impunity. Everywhere we destroyed enemy fighters. But secret reports from the front said that the Americans had new planes far superior to the R-39 and R-40. And for the first time I learned what happened at Midway at the end of June. 4 aircraft carriers. Almost 300 airplanes lost, most of them with their pilots. It was unbelievable. My heart sank when I saw the new pilots arriving at the Hainan Air Regiment. They were energetic and serious young men, undoubtedly courageous. But determination and courage are no substitute for flying skill, and all of them lacked the training that would be required to fight the Americans who had launched an offensive across the Pacific. These recruits, with their shining young faces, would they be able to fill the gaps left by the deaths of pilots like Sasai or Ota? Of course not. And tell me, for God's sake, how could they even be expected to do so? The training course they'd undergone in Toyohashi had been tough. From sunrise to sunset, the instructors drove them hard. Classes, flying and flying again. Teaching them to fly in formation. You're holding the control stick, not a mop. It's not enough to pilot an airplane, you have to become part of the airplane. Learn to conserve fuel. Short bursts, don't try to burn out the cannons. We had to teach them all the lessons they'd learned in the recent battles. We tried to teach them all the little tricks and secret techniques we knew. But we had too little time. We could not follow the individual mistakes of each pilot, to then long hours of training to polish to automaticity correct actions. Not a day went by that fire trucks and ambulances did not jump onto the runway, sirens blaring. And we pulled out of the wreckage of the airplane another pilot who made a mistake on takeoff or landing. However, not all of the recruits were so bad that they couldn't handle a training airplane or fighter. Many were gifted no less than the great aces of 1939 or 1940. But there were too few of them, and in any case we could not train them through the full course, and give them any combat experience before throwing them into combat against the best American squadrons. Less than a month after the retreat from Guadalcanal, I was called to a special officers' meeting where a report of a new disaster was read. This message remained secret until the end of the war, and the Japanese people were never made aware of it. Behind closed doors, we were told that a large Japanese convoy, 12 transports, 8 destroyers and several smaller ships had attempted to bring army units to Leh, my former air base. At least 100 enemy fighters and bombers attacked the convoy on the high seas. In a series of sustained attacks, all the transports and at least 5 destroyers were sunk. This news was even more terrible than the defeat at Guadalcanal. It meant that now the enemy completely dominates the air north of Leh, and we will not be able to prevent air attacks against our shipping, which are becoming increasingly deadly. A few days later, the Hainan Air Regiment was ordered to immediately relocate to Rabaul. Captain 2nd Rank Nakajima asked me if I would agree to follow him to the Southwest Pacific. Did he doubt that I desired anything different? Nakajima told me that despite the loss of my right eye, he still considered me a much better pilot than the rookies. In the evening, HQ posted a list of pilots who were going to Rabaul. My name was among them. However, we failed to reach an agreement with the chief doctor of the airbase. He became furious when he saw me on the list. The doctor rushed to Nakajima's office and vented all his anger on the unfortunate Captain 2nd Rank. "What are you thinking? Are you trying to kill him? What's the matter with you if you're going to throw a one-eyed pilot into battle? He doesn't stand a chance. That's a crime. I won't let Sakai go to Rabaul." We could hear him yelling even from across the airfield. Nakajima protested. He argued that I was better than all the new pilots with 2 eyes or 1, that no one could match me in the art of flying the Zero, and that no one had such vast combat experience. The doctor stood his ground unwaveringly. Now it was time for Nakajima to get angry. They argued to a hoarse pitch for several hours, but in the end the doctor was still the winner. He convinced Nakajima to change his mind. As he was leaving the command center, I ran up to him and begged him to let me fly. He just bawled his eyes out. For a while the doctor just couldn't speak, but his face poured red little by little until he howled shut up. Pushing me away, he ran away, muttering under his breath that all pilots are just crazy. I was transferred as a flight training instructor to Omura Air Base near Sasebo. The new air regiment arrived in Rabaul on April 3rd. Not a week later, I read in the front reports that they had conducted major attacks against Guadalcanal, Milne Bay, Port Darwin, and other important targets. But in 4 combat sorties, enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down no less than 49 aircraft from the regiment. Disaster followed disaster. April 19th among the officers crept a terrible rumor, soon confirmed. On April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto, the brilliant commander of the Imperial Navy, was killed. I read and reread the bulletin. Admiral Yamamoto was flying in one of 2 bombers under cover of Zero fighters when several new American P-38 fighters broke through the veil and shot down both bombers. And I was stuck in Omura, training new pilots. I couldn't believe myself as more and more cadets were arriving at Omura, who could barely get an airplane in the air. The Navy desperately needed pilots, so the school staff was increasing almost every month. But this meant a steady decline in requirements. People who before the war could not even dream of getting close to a fighter plane now sat in its cockpit and into combat. Some kind of unhealthy fever began. We were demanded to speed up the training of cadets, to forget about all the requirements. Just teach them to fly and shoot. One after another, in pairs and even in threes, training airplanes crashed into the ground, bouncing clumsily into the air. For many months I tried to mold fighter pilots from the raw materials that were brought to Omura. But it was a hopeless task. Our capabilities were limited, and there were too many cadets. I felt that I simply could not stand it. There was no doubt that our country was in grave danger. The civilian population did not suspect it, neither did the cadets, nor did the ordinary pilots. But those officers who saw the reports, who participated in the battles, understood the gravity of the situation. But the majority retained an unshakable faith that Japan would still come out of this struggle victorious. However, the celebrations and joyous clamours became rarer and rarer. Even the fact that our airbase was very far from the battlefield did not lessen the bitterness. In September 1943, I was simply shocked when I was informed that my old close friend and one of the best Japanese ace naval aviator, First Class Kenji Okabe, was shot down over Bougainville-Lel and killed. He and I trained together at Chisuchiura, and it was he who set the highest achievement among naval aviators when he shot down 7 enemy planes in one battle. Will there be an end to these deaths? What I read filled my heart with bitterness. After Okabe's stunning victory in the skies over Rabaul, Admiral Ninichi Kusaka, commander of the 11th Air Fleet, demanded that the command in Tokyo award the pilot a medal for exceptional bravery, to no avail. Tokyo coldly replied that the request was denied for lack of precedent, just as it had denied Captain First Rank Saito a year earlier. Admiral Kusaka, however, was a persistent man. Infuriated by the staff's callous decision, the admiral personally rewarded Okabe by presenting him with his own ceremonial sword. 3 days later, Okabe was killed when his Zero, engulfed in flames, crashed into the jungle. In April 1944, after long and tiring months as an instructor at Omura, I was transferred to the Yokosuka Air Regiment. Before the war, this would have been considered an honourable assignment, as it was the Imperial Air Guard that covered the air approaches to Tokyo. But now it was an entirely different regiment. The days of honourable service were long over. Since I was an officer, I could familiarise myself with the secret bulletins and see the true picture of the war. The secret reports differed from the pompous statements on the radio for the common people, like heaven from earth. Our troops were beginning to retreat throughout the Pacific theatre. American ships roamed freely throughout the Pacific. Their operational formations were equal in strength to fleets, and their fleets outnumbered everything imaginable. I read bulletin after bulletin of the crushing blows of these fast-moving fleets. The enemy Army Air Force was expanding just as rapidly. Hundreds of new fighters P-38 Lightnings circled at high altitudes, out of reach of our fighters, and chose where and when to give battle. Almost every day there were new types of fighters and bombers. Stories of our pilots about the dramatic improvement in their flying qualities made us look anxiously into the future. We were still clinging to Rabaul, but now this once formidable bastion no longer posed any threat to Port Moresby and other enemy bases. Rabaul was under constant attack. The Americans began using it as a training ground for inexperienced pilots. Shortly after arriving in Yokosuka, I requested a discharge and travelled by train from the naval base to Tokyo, which was only an hour and a half away. My uncle's family welcomed me like a native son. I knew that now, if I could get away from the base for a few hours, I could rest at home. In the evening after dinner, Hatsuo began to rebuke me for still not getting married. Her words sounded both serious and funny at the same time. And I couldn't stand it. Why are you still alone, dear sister? What has happened to you if you haven't found a wonderful husband yet? My uncle and aunt interrupted the altercation that had begun by ridiculing us. You're both too picky, my uncle quipped. I grinned. I don't understand why Hatsuo-san hasn't found a husband. Look at her. She's beautiful, like a real movie star. And how many girls today can play the piano? I'm sure you've chosen a wonderful husband for her, I told them, looking intently at Hatsuo. My uncle and aunt smiled hearing that, but not Hatsuo. She blushed to the roots of her hair and turned away, her eyes filled with tears. What's the matter, Hatsuo-san? She didn't answer. I was embarrassed. Hatsuo was clearly angry with me. Then I quickly changed the topic of conversation. Hatsuo-san, give me the pleasure, please. Where's the piano around here? It's been so long since I've heard you play. She looked at me questioningly. Do you remember the first time we met? You were playing, let me remember. Yes, that's right. Mozart. Would you play that piece again? Instead of answering, Hatsuo walked over to the piano and opened it. As her fingers ran across the keys and the enchanting sounds poured out, I still hadn't forgotten about the war that was raging 1,000 miles away, somewhere far away on the Pacific Ocean. As soon as I closed my eyes, the blue exhaust of fighter and bomber planes floated before me as they raced down the runway, leaving a puff of dust in their wake. With a deafening roar of engines, they lift off and disappear into the night, many of them never to return. And I am sitting here in the suburbs of Tokyo, warm and cozy, enjoying the company of people who love me like a native son, while others are on their way to their deaths. It's a strange world. The play is over. Hatsuo sat motionless for a few moments, and then turned and looked at me in a strange way. In the wide-open eyes lurked an unasked question. Only quietly said Saburo-san, "I want to play something else, especially for you. Listen carefully. Let the music say what I can't put into words." She looked so strange. Then her face flashed and she hastily lowered her gaze. Hatsuo played for quite a long time. Waves of music spread across the room, rising and falling, growing louder and subsiding. I looked at that girl. I knew her, but as it turned out, I didn't know her at all. I had never seen Hatsuo like this before. What did she mean when she said, "Let music say what I can't put into words"? And suddenly I realized that I was looking at Hatsuo not as a little girl, not as my cousin, but as a woman. It was as if I was seeing her for the first time. Her fingers fluttered across the keys, and her face lit up as she poured her soul into the music. Hatsuo. Me too. The thought was unexpected, but she hadn't been a child for a long time. Wake up, Sakai, you fool. She's a woman. Today, right now, she's telling you she loves you. Now I knew what it all meant, and I wanted to respond to this explosion of feelings, but I kept telling myself it couldn't happen. But it did. Hatsuo, you love her, you fool, and you didn't even know how she felt. I remembered the hospital when she hugged me and convinced me I could fly again. She must love me, and for much longer than I could have imagined. It's amazing. And in that moment I realized that I was in love too. With her. But what can I do? I had already experienced that awful moment a few months ago when Fujiko cried after my rejection. Are the reasons any less valid today? If I was able to refuse Fujiko's love then because I was half blind, why should I respond differently now to Hatsuo's unspoken confession? Should I step on the throat of my own pride and give up hope? I still believed that a miracle would happen. I would fully see and return to the air again. Could I do such a thing and maintain my inner integrity? No. Therefore, Hatsuo's message was in vain. I didn't give the appearance that I understood it and that I was eager to respond in agreement. Then Hatsuo finished playing. I waited as long as politeness demanded, and then went to the bedroom, citing fatigue. But I didn't manage to sleep for very long. During my service in Yokosuka, I visited Tokyo frequently. During the 18 months of my absence, the capital had changed a lot. It had become dull and boring. People had almost stopped laughing. The streets had become deserted and gloomy. Passers-by walked with their heads down, absorbed in their own worries. The Navy March no longer aroused enthusiasm. Too many sons of this nation, too many husbands and brothers, fathers, nephews would never come home again. But in Tokyo the war was not yet fully felt, though the shouts had already fallen silent. Stores began to lose goods, and strict food rationing was imposed. People stood in long lines in the cold wind to get a cup of hot chowder. But the homeland had not yet suffered, save for one raid in 1942, when Doolittle's brave bombers flew over the city and fled to China. Tokyo and other cities were not yet disturbed by the whistle of American bombs and the rumble of bursts. In June 1944, however, the war came to Japan. Its impact on the people was incredible. On June 15th, people were shocked to hear that 20 bombers, huge air giants that outnumbered even the formidable B-17s, attacked the cities of northern Kyushu, having travelled an incredible distance from China to do so. The raid did little damage, and 20 airplanes certainly could not have caused serious alarm to the entire nation. But in homes and streets, in factories and fields, everywhere in Japan, people were talking about the raid. They were discussing the inability of our fighter planes to stop the bombers, and they were asking questions. Who's next? Where? When? And how many bombers would be coming? And soon the newspapers reported another disturbing piece of news. The Americans had landed on Saipan. Now it was safe to say that the war had come home through another door. Saipan was not that far away. Geographical maps were pulled out of cabinets, and people looked at the tiny dot that was relatively close to the shores of Japan. They looked at each other anxiously. And then came the questions. They were not asked loudly, but only in private conversations. How could this happen after continuous victorious reports? If we had sunk the enemy ships, destroyed their airplanes, exterminated their armies, why did they land on Saipan? This question was asked by literally everyone, but no one dared to answer it. As soon as we received word of the enemy landing on Saipan, a large force of our navy went to the Mariana Islands. All of us at Yokosuka Air Base realized that the decisive battle of the war would be fought. We were no longer landing on enemy islands, now we had to defend the gates of our own home. The next morning, the Yokosuka Air Regiment was ordered to relocate to the island of Iwo Jima. The High Command feared that, having gained a foothold on Saipan, the Americans would next strike at this strategically important point. Once they had Iwo Jima, they could threaten all of Japan. The greatest battle in the Mariana Islands was over. Saipan has fallen into enemy hands. Our navy had suffered a crushing defeat, but the American task force roamed the Pacific, still all-powerful, indestructible and fearless. The fact that the enemy did not land on Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944 surprised us all. The defense of the island was in its infancy. Some of the forces that stormed Saipan could have landed on Iwo Jima. They would have easily broken the resistance of the handful of soldiers on the island at the time, but for reasons unknown, the landing was delayed for several months. During this time, the Army and Navy moved a large number of troops and armaments to the small island, which was of great importance. When the Yokosuka Air Regiment was ordered to organize air defense of the island, we were able to allocate only 30 fighters for this task. 30 fighters, and they were the same Zeros I had fought in China 5 years earlier. And that was it. However, the invasion did not take place. We considered this turn of events a miracle. Captain 2nd Rank Nakajima returned to Yokosuka. A month after we left Toyohashi for Rabaul, Tokyo ordered him to return to Japan, where he was assigned to Yokosuka. Nakajima was to organize the training of new pilots in record time. And now, after spending a year in his homeland, he was again going to the overseas theatre. But now he was facing battles much larger than any he had previously participated in. I received orders to report to his office. "Sakai, why don't you go with me again?" he asked. "You know how much I want you to fly with me. I don't care at all what the doctors say. You were and still are an excellent pilot. I'm convinced of that every time I see you in the air." He paused. "But let's be perfectly honest, Sakai. And better than most, the questionable merits of our new pilots. I'm afraid they'll be outgunned as soon as they encounter the new American planes. We need something to boost their morale, to give them the will to fight. So, Saburo, you realize how much I need you. I need you desperately. You're almost a god to these people. If you come with us, they'll feel much more confident. They'll follow you anywhere." I exploded. "Was it necessary to ask me, Mr. Captain 2nd Rank? Are you asking me if I agree to fly with you? How many times have I asked for it? And how many times have I been told, 'No, you can't fly. Sakai, you're half-blind. Sakai, of course I want to fly. I want to fly with you. I want to fight again.'" Times had changed. Now, no doctor dared even squeak a peep against my return to action. There were no more restrictions on one-eyed pilots. We could no longer afford to pay attention to such trivial matters. Japan itself was now under threat, so the lack of one eye for a fighter pilot was no longer considered a handicap. I was back to life again. My country needed me. We received orders to fly to Iwo Jima immediately. We didn't even have time to warn our families. No touching farewells. On the morning of June 16th, we flew out of Yokosuka, lined up and set course for the distant island. But we didn't get there. After a 100-mile flight in low billowing clouds under a heavy downpour, we were forced to fly back to Yokosuka. It was the beginning of the rainy season in Japan. Nakajima and I could have flown to Iwo Jima like a couple or two other pilots. But most of our 30 pilots were totally inexperienced. A thunderstorm could scatter them in different directions, which would mean certain death for them. Iwo Jima is a tiny island 650 miles south of Yokosuka. It has no more than 2 miles at its widest point. On a world map, Iwo Jima is the last rung in a long ladder of Bonin Islands rising from Guam to Yokosuka. Maps, however, are deceptive. They do not give a full picture of the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where vast distances separate island from island. Our Zeros had no radar, they didn't even have radios, so we couldn't risk losing most of our planes. We had already had tragic experience with such flights. In early 1943, several squadrons of Army fighters, piloted by pilots with absolutely no experience in long-range flights over the ocean, travelled south from Japan. Along the way they encountered a bad weather zone, but refused to turn back. Almost all of the airplanes went missing, somewhere in the middle of the ocean. On the morning of June 17th, we made another attempt. This time we had not travelled 100 miles as a storm forced us to return to Yokosuka. Ironically, the weather was beautiful on Iwo Jima and the Mariana Islands. We dispersed to our barracks and listened to radio reports from our island garrisons, which were subjected to enemy air raids almost around the clock. 4 times we tried to reach Iwo Jima, and all 4 times thunderstorms prevented us from doing so. On June 20th, when we made our 5th attempt, the weather conditions were also far from safe. However, Nakajima was determined to break through at all costs. The inexperienced pilots had to get their teeth and claws into the tail of the leading Zero. So we flew onward in the pouring rain, through the strongest gusts of wind. At the time, none of us suspected that this was the day our fleet suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the planes and guns of the enemy task force that was rattling the Mariana Islands. Finally, we broke through the storm front. The cone of Iwo Jima's volcano rose above the sea. Nakajima made a wide circle over the second airfield at Mount Motoyama in the center of Iwo Jima. I've mentioned the dusty strip at Leh before, calling it bad, but this one was simply unimaginable. Landing on the deck of an aircraft carrier rocking on the waves was easier than landing on this nightmare. There were steep cliffs on either side of the runway. If the plane skidded even a little on landing, a pillar of fire. And at the end of the runway, the same cliffs awaited the careless pilot who forgot the brakes. Nakajima refused to put his rookies on this treacherous runway. He led our group back to the first airfield on the southern slope of the volcano. The runway here was quite long and wide. One by one the fighters went down. More than 90 airplanes were lined up along this runway. To park our fighters, there wasn't even an inch of space left. Nakajima waved his hand from the cockpit, ordering the rest of the planes to follow. A long, winding road led from the main airfield to the second runway. The distance was over a mile, and the little runway was higher than the one we had flown away from. I felt like the ultimate fool as I drove the Zero down the road. It was my first and thankfully my last experience climbing uphill in the cockpit of a fighter jet. A convoy of 30 fighters. A battalion of infantrymen, mouths agape, watched us as we drove by, roaring engines and raising clouds of dust. They couldn't believe their own eyes. Many pointed their hands at us and laughed loudly. But we were not laughing at that time. It was very dangerous to drive Zero on the treacherous mountain slope, following the fighter plane rolling ahead, having the rotating propeller of another airplane behind us. In addition, we were forced to repeat all the twists and turns of this mountain path. Fortunately, we arrived at Iwo Jima during a brief respite in the fighting. The day before yesterday, the island was shuddering and swaying under the thousands of shells which the American ships had rained down upon it. Now they were back towards Saipan, turning almost all of Iwo Jima's fortifications into ruins. For 3 days, the war had left Iwo Jima behind. But it was still not a place a person would want to stay. The island was just as bleak, hostile, and uncomfortable as Rabaul, if not worse. But we were on our own, and used the respite from the fighting to bathe in the hot springs that gushed from under the rocks, literally all over the island. But at the same time, we never for a moment forgot about the war. We knew that our fleet had been defeated in the naval battle of the Mariana Islands, in which almost all the aircraft carrier pilots had been killed. There was no doubting the immense power of the American invasion force, which would be supported by hundreds of airplanes and thousands of heavy ship guns. They would wipe out the Saipan garrison to the last man. Meanwhile, we were taking hot baths on Iwo Jima. Our officers were desperate. They knew they had to do something to help Saipan. But what could we do? A massive raid by our fighters would have only a marginal effect, and therefore no point. Besides, Saipan is 600 miles from Iwo Jima. On the other hand, we couldn't sit idly by while our comrades died. There was another consideration. If we leave Iwo Jima without a few dozen fighters ready to fly to intercept, the Americans could strike at that very time. And then the island's defences would collapse, offering only the weakest resistance. Finally, it was decided to leave the fighters on the island, but send bombers to attack American ships cruising near Saipan. The attacks were to be carried out at night in groups of 8 or 9 bombers without escort. As I watched these planes scattering for takeoff, the blue tongues of exhaust illuminating the wings and fuselages, the days spent in Leh involuntarily came to mind. I finally began to understand what drove the crews of Mitchells and Marauders, who bombed Leh day and night without any fighter escort and headlong rushed straight into the jaws of dozens of bloodthirsty Zeros. Now I saw the same picture, but from the other side. And the situation was even worse. In early 1942, the American twin-engine bombers had a certain chance of success, but with Betty everything was different. If a fighter for a second or two will notice this bomber, or anti-aircraft shell will send a fountain of red-hot shrapnel into his fuselage, the crew has not even a shadow of a chance. In a matter of seconds, the flaming pile will crash with a roar into the sea. The time between takeoff and the return of the surviving bombers stretched to infinity. Our pilots in conducting raids showed the utmost courage and achieved several hits. But what good was it? Only pinpricks. And every night 1 or 2 bombers came crawling back to Iwo Jima with shot wings and fuselages. The pilots were deadly tired. Their eyes burned with despair as they saw one by one their comrades perish before they could break through to the target. The few pilots who returned to the island told us of fighters attacking them in almost total darkness. They unmistakably found our planes in the darkness. And then night turned into day as the sky was illuminated by thousands of glittering anti-aircraft gun trails from the ships. The bright flashes of explosions and the web of traces created an impenetrable wall of fire, blocking the path of the bombers. In just a few days there were almost no twin-engine bombers left on the island. Then Iwo Jima launched single-engine torpedo carriers JIL, which tried to conduct torpedo attacks from a minimum height. But they were no luckier than the big planes. On June 24th, the respite enjoyed by Iwo Jima came to an end. At about 0530, air raid sirens sounded over the island. Search radar detected a large group of enemy planes about 60 miles to the south, and they were rapidly approaching. There were about 80 Zeros on the island, and all of them hurriedly took off from the 2 airfields. Mechanics quickly dragged the surviving Betty and Jills to shelters. Here we go. My long wait was rewarded. I had the Zero in my hands again, and in just a few minutes, already in the real flames of battle, I would see if I had lost my skill. The clouds held at 13,000 feet over the sea. The fighters split into 2 groups. 40 Zeros rose above the cloud layer, while the other 40 my group stayed below. Barely had I finished gaining altitude when an enemy fighter dropped out of the cloud, dragging a long tail of fire and black smoke behind it. It took me only a moment to see it a brand new type of airplane with wide wings and a blunt nose. It was the new Grumman fighter I had heard so much about, the Hellcat. I executed a steep turn and immediately saw another Hellcat. It flew out of the cloud and went vertically downward, smoking heavily. But literally after the downed airplanes appeared dozens more Hellcat, which steeply dive at us. All 40 Zero turned around and went up to meet the enemy. The American pilots, without thinking for a second, rushed into the attack. The planes then scattered all over the sky, and from the water to the clouds, fighting boiled over. The formation broke up. I made a tight loop and lined up in the tail Hellcat, releasing a line barely he flashed in my sights. But the American turned away, and my bullets pierced the air. I went into a vertical spiral, continuing to close in and trying to put a line into his belly. The Hellcat tried to intercept me on the turn, but that's exactly what I needed. Its belly filled the entire field of view, and I fired a second round. The cannon shells exploded, hitting him in the fuselage. The next second, a cloud of black smoke billowed behind the American plane, and it tumbled haphazardly into the sea. Everywhere I looked, there were fighter planes, long streaks of black smoke, flashes of fire, exploding airplanes. But I stared too long. A glittering track passed under my wing. Instinctively, I jerked the handle to the left, trying to get in its tail and dodge another line. Missed. He ducked and got away from me much faster than I could have expected. I cursed myself for letting myself be taken by surprise, and I cursed my blind eye, which had left me unable to see nearly half the horizon. As quickly as possible, I freed myself from the straps of the parachute, so as to be able to twirl freely on the seat, and thus compensate for the loss of side vision. And the next second it did some good. At my tail I saw half a dozen Hellcats already moving into firing position. Flashes flashed on their wings as the machine guns began to fire. Another left turn quickly, and the trails swept harmlessly by. 6 fighters sped past and began to gain altitude with a right turn. Bad timing. Oh, bad timing. I hit the throttle, turning on the afterburner, and raced after them with all the speed I could squeeze out of my Zero. Just in case I looked behind me, there was no one behind me. But one of them will be mine, I'm sure. The distance between the Zero and the nearest American was rapidly closing. From a distance of 50 yards, I opened fire from the cannons and saw how the shells penetrated the fuselage and disappeared into the cockpit. A flame flashed under the lantern and smoke billowed from there. The next instant, the Hellcat jerked awkwardly and dropped to the wing. The plume of smoke grew longer and longer. But a new group of fighters was already on my tail. I didn't want to get close to them at all. A leaden cloak of fatigue came over me. In the old days in Leh, I would have immediately turned the Zero around and rushed at them. But now I was overcome by a kind of clammy lethargy, and I didn't feel like fighting at all. I swooped down and flew away. It would have been suicide to fight the Hellcats in that condition. 1 second's hesitation, one wrong move of the handle or pedals, and it would all be over. I need time to catch my breath, to shake off this incomprehensible dizziness. Maybe it was the result of trying to see with one eye as much as I used to see with 2. All I knew was that I couldn't fight anymore. I flew north, using afterburner to increase my speed. The Hellcats turned back and went after more prey. And then I saw what was the most amazing aerial fight in all the hundreds of aerial battles I'd been in. I turned to the right and gaped. The Hellcat was spinning desperately, trying to get away from the Zero hanging on its tail, which was firing its cannons from less than 50 yards away. But close to the Zero, another Hellcat was chasing it. The next second, another Zero came down from somewhere overhead and chased this Hellcat in a steep dive. They flew one after another, resembling a writhing snake. The second Zero, absorbed in the pursuit of the Hellcat, did not realize that a third Hellcat had swooped down on him. And the third Zero, seeing this amazing procession, made a sharp turn and suddenly attacked the trailing Hellcat. It was strange and frightening to see it. A column of death swept past me, each pilot determined to destroy his prey, firing from all guns and machine guns. Hellcat, Zero, Hellcat, Zero, Zero, Hellcat, Zero. Are all these pilots, both Japanese and Americans, so stupid that none of them are watching their own tails? The Hellcat's lead fighter frantically wiggled, threw out a tail of black smoke, and crashed into the sea. Almost at the same moment, the Zero that was chasing it exploded, turning into a ball of fire. The Hellcat that struck the fatal blow lasted 2 seconds longer. The next Zero's shells tore off its wing, and it spun around, falling into the sea. But barely had the shot-off wing flown off when a bright flash of explosion witnessed the demise of the second Zero. And as soon as the third Hellcat skipped through the cloud of smoke, shells chasing him Zero blew his cockpit into splinters. 5 planes fell into the sea. I saw 5 splashes. The last Zero did a loop, turned and flew away, the only survivor in the bloody mess. I circled slowly north of Iwo Jima, convulsively gulping air and trying to regain consciousness. The dizziness passed, and I returned to the battle area, but the battle was already over. In the sky were still visible Zero and Hellcat, but they kept at a great distance. Japanese and American pilots were regrouping. Ahead and to the right I saw 15 Zeros flying in a compact group, and I flew close to them. I'm going to join them now. I was just below. Hellcats. Now I realized why at one time the doctor had protested so vehemently against my return to action. With one eye the perspective was distorted, fine details were blurred, and I could not recognize the aircraft at a distance. It wasn't until I noticed the white stars on the blue wings that I realized my mistake. I didn't waste another second. I immediately turned left and darted into a dive, picking up speed and hoping the Hellcats didn't have time to spot me. They didn't. The Hellcats formation broke up and they took off in pursuit of me. What could I do? The situation seemed almost hopeless. But there was one way to escape, though the chances were slim. I was almost over Iwo Jima. If I could maneuver them an almost impossible task, they would run out of fuel and be forced to leave. But only now did I appreciate the speed of the new American fighters. In a matter of seconds, they had caught up with me. That's amazing. There was no point in running any farther. I turned back sharply. This maneuver puzzled the enemy pilots as I came up to them from below, spiraling. But now it was my turn to be surprised. They did not scatter. The lead fighter responded with the same spiral, exactly repeating my maneuver. I twisted the spiral tighter and tighter. But the enemy fighters didn't give up a foot. It was something new. An Airacobra or a P-40 would have corkscrewed trying to compete with me. Even a Wildcat couldn't pull a spiral like the Zero for long. But these new Hellcats were the most maneuverable airplanes I had ever seen. I completed the spiral and was trapped. 15 fighters completed their spirals and lined up in a long column. And the next second I found myself inside a giant ring of 15 Hellcats. Their wide wings with white stars flashed on all sides. If any pilot was getting surrounded in the air, it was me. I had no time to bemoan my bad luck. 4 Hellcats left the formation and swooped down on me. They, too, were eager to fight. I easily turned away from them, and the Hellcats sped past on inertia. But I remembered that a small slip would expose me to the other fighters. The second quartet left the ring and began to tail me. I sped away, squeezing all the power I could out of my engine. I managed to get out of range of their machine guns. I didn't care about the 4 planes chasing me, but the first 4. I came right at them. They had gained altitude after their fruitless dive and were above me again, preparing for a second approach. I sharply pushed the pedal with my right foot, tilting the Zero to the left, then the handle to the left as well, turning abruptly. A chain of sparks flew under my right wing, followed by a Hellcat. From the barrel roll I went into a turn. The second Hellcat was 700 yards behind me, its yellow lights flashing on its wings. If I hadn't guessed it before, I would have realized it now. The enemy pilots were as green as my own. That's what saved my life. The second fighter continued to approach, pouring tracers into the sky, though they didn't even reach me. Come on, come on. Keep firing. Spend your ammo faster, it'll be less trouble for me. I made another turn and sped away. The Hellcat was closing in fast. When he was 200 yards away, I turned left and the Americans sped past, shooting into the empty sky. I lost my patience. Why would I run away from such hapless pilots? Without thinking, I turned back and tailgated him. At 50 yards, I fired my cannon. Missed. I had failed to take the correct lead, not taking into account the drift of my fighter after a sharp turn. But in the next moment I completely forgot about the fighter flickering in front of me. Another Hellcat appeared on my tail, continuously firing machine guns. Left turn again, a maneuver that never failed me. Hellcat, roaring engine, flew past, followed by the third and fourth planes of this group. But the other 4 fighters were now right above me, ready to dive. Sometimes to defend yourself you have to attack. I went vertically upward, right at them. The pilots wiggled their wings, trying to see me. But I didn't have time to disperse them. 3 more Hellcats appeared from the right. I barely dodged their trails, making the same left turn. The American fighters lined up again in a big ring, and wherever I turned, several Hellcats were blocking my escape route. I circled in the middle of the American circle, trying to figure out how to get out of here. However, the enemy was not going to let me do that. One by one the Hellcats came out of the circle and rushed at me, opening fire as soon as the distance was shortened. I can't remember how many times I was attacked, or how many times I had to dodge. I was soaking wet, sweat trickling down my body in rivulets. Acrid drops of sweat came into my left eye, and it began to burn. I cursed the stinging liquid. I just didn't have time to wipe my forehead. All I could do was blink frantically, trying to get rid of the salty drops and see something. Gradually, I began to tire. I didn't know if I would be able to escape from the ring of fire, but it was quite clear to me that these American pilots were noticeably worse than their own airplanes. An inner voice kept telling me what to do. It didn't stop for a second. Speed. Keep your speed up. Forget about the engine, burn it, but keep the speed, keep swerving. Don't stop swerving. My arms were starting to go numb from the exertion, as I had to constantly lay down left turns to dodge the Hellcats' tracks. If I let up even a little pressure on the handle, it would immediately lead to doom. But how long would I be able to keep turning at such a high speed? I must. While the Hellcats are trying to maintain a circular formation, only one plane can attack me. And I had no doubt that I would be able to evade the attack of a single plane. The tracks are close, but that's not enough. They have to hit the target precisely to bring down my plane. And it didn't matter if a bullet flew 100 yards away or 100 miles away, as long as I dodged it. I needed time. To dodge the fighters that one by one rushed at me, and then return to their place in the ring. Roll. Full throttle. Handle to the left. One more. Hard right. Sea and sky spinning wildly. Glide. Glide. Next. Close. Tracks. Bright. Sparkling. Sparkling. Always under the wing. Handlebar forward. On. Keep up the speed. Swerve left. Swing. My arm. I can barely feel it. If the Hellcat pilots had chosen a different method of attack or taken more careful aim, I would have been shot down. But not once have the enemy pilots been able to get a proper lead. If a single fighter had fired a line forward, to the place where I was rushing, I would have run straight into his bullets. But this is a common characteristic of average pilots. Their psychology has certain peculiarities, and exceptions are extremely rare. But it's those rare exceptions that make the real aces. 91% of all pilots stubbornly follow the formulas they were taught in flight school. Teach them to act according to a certain pattern, and they never dare to deviate from it, even when they find themselves in a battle where life and death are separated by a fraction of an inch. As a result, this unequal battle has become an endurance contest between my hands and the Hellcat's fuel supply. Either I would make a mistake in executing the turn, or they would be forced to return to their aircraft carriers. I glanced at the speedometer. Almost 350 mph. The Zero was simply not capable of more. But I needed stamina other than arm strength. This fighter's no ironclad either. I feared for the wings. They were literally cracking from constant overloads during steep turns. There was a danger that the metal would fail and the wing would simply break. But there was nothing I could do about it. I could only keep turning. Either I could force the plane into another evasive maneuver, or I could die. Turn. Handlebar back. Lead. Glide. One more. Fuck the wings. Swerve. I was suddenly deaf. The roar of the Zero's engine, the rumble of the Hellcat's engines, the jerky crackle of 12.7mm machine gun trails all gone. My eyes are watering. Sweat drips down my forehead. I can't wipe it away. Look. Handle forward. Pedal. The highway again. and passed again. The altimeter was down to almost zero. The waves were already crashing right below my plane. Raise the wings, Sakai, or you'll catch the wave with the console. Where did our fight start? At 13,000 feet. Nearly 2.5 miles of slips and flips, and lower. Now I had no altitude to spare. But the Hellcats can't repeat their approaches like they used to. They can't dive, as that would mean just diving into the sea. Now they're going to have to come up with something new, and I'll get a few seconds. I grabbed the control stick with my left hand and shook it hard with my right. It hurt. My whole body ached. Dull ache and numbness. Here they come, slipping out of the circle. They're acting very cautiously now, clearly wary of me. He's making his own turn. Coming in from the turn. It's not hard to dodge him now. Slip to the left. Let's see. Tracks. A chain of fountains running through the water. Splash. Foam. Followed by the next one. How many times have they attacked me like this? I've lost count. When's it going to end? They must be running out of gas. But I can't do the turns as efficiently anymore. My hands keep going numb. I can no longer feel them. Instead of a fast and tight circle, the Zero is now a stretched oval, wasting time on every maneuver. The Hellcats see this. They persist in their attacks, clearly growing bolder. Their runs are so frequent that I barely have time to catch my breath. I can't take it anymore. I must break away. I go into another left turn, but I immediately hit the pedal and jerk sharply to the right. The Zero turns around literally on the spot, and I fire at the first fighter I see to break the ring. I break free and rush away, gliding over the water. The Hellcats scrambled around for a while, then chased me again. Half of the planes built a barrier over my head, and the others, machine guns blasting furiously, chased after me. The Hellcats had too much speed. In a matter of seconds, they came within firing distance. I continued to take the right little by little, frantically jerking the handle so that the Zero bounced with every maneuver. Fountains of white foam exploded from the left. A new line almost hits my plane. The Americans stubbornly refuse to give up the chase. Now the top fighters descend to attack me. The rear Hellcats immediately stop firing, and the ones dive bombing try to guess my moves. I can barely move my arms and legs. There's no escape. If I keep flying at low altitude, in a couple more minutes I'll be too slow on the control stick. And then, why wait for death by running away like a coward? I yanked the control stick hard, almost pinning it to my chest. The Zero rocketed upward, tumbling onto its back, and the Hellcat appeared 100 yards in front of me. Its bewildered pilot swiveled his head, trying to see my plane. But the fighters behind him were already turning toward me. I only needed this one, however. The Hellcat jerked clumsily, trying to escape. There. I pressed the throttles, and the tracks flashed through the air. But my arms were too tired. The Hellcat jerked, and I could no longer react to its maneuver. He turned sharply, went upward, and took off. But my loop helped me. The rest of the American fighters frantically scrambled around. I gained a little altitude and sprinted away again. The Hellcats were far behind. Those fools suddenly started firing at 500 yards. Waste ammunition, waste ammunition, waste ammunition. I must have shouted very loudly, but they were too fast-moving. Soon the trails flashed by my wings, and I laid down a desperate turn. Suddenly Iwo Jima appeared again below. I shook my wings, hoping to draw the anti-aircraft gunners' attention to the red circles of the identification marks. It was a mistake. I lost speed, and the Hellcats caught up with me again. Where are the anti-aircraft guns? What happened to them? Shoot, you morons, shoot. Suddenly Iwo Jima burst into flames. Bright flashes flashed all over the island. They fired from all guns, multicolored trails stretched from below. The explosions shook the Zero. Puffs of smoke appeared in the air among the Hellcats. They turned sharply and spiraled away. I continued to rush at full speed. I was terrified. I was even afraid to look back for fear that the Americans would return. I was afraid that the next track would hit my airplane, tear up the skin and go through the cockpit, tearing me to pieces. I sped past Iwo Jima, fist nudging the throttle sector to make my plane fly even faster. Faster, faster. South of the island, something else appeared on the horizon. A cloud. A huge thundercloud rising high above the sea. I wasn't too bothered by the whirlwinds. I only wanted one thing to get away from those fighters. At full speed, I dived into the swirling mass. A huge fist grabbed the Zero and tossed it aside. I saw nothing but bright flashes of lightning, and then blackness descended. I lost control of the airplane. The Zero tumbled helplessly. First it went belly up, then it went down on the wing, and finally it went nose down. And then I broke through the cloud. The squall inside the cloud gave my fighter a good kick. I was flying upside down again. I could only regain control at 1,600 feet. Far to the south I could barely make out a flock of 15 Hellcats returning to their aircraft carrier. It was hard to believe that the terrible ordeal was over and I was still alive. I had a terrible urge to sit down as soon as possible. I just wanted to feel the solid ground beneath my feet. I landed at Iwo Jima's main airfield. I sat in the cockpit for a few minutes recovering, completely exhausted. Then I climbed out. All the fighters had long since landed. A crowd of pilots and mechanics, shouting and waving their arms, rushed toward the plane as soon as it stopped. Nakajima was among them. He put his arms around my neck, shouting joyfully, "You did it, Sakai. You did it." 15 against 1. That's incredible. I leaned tiredly against the plane, cursing my blind eye. It had nearly ruined me. The officer patted me on the back. "We almost went crazy down here. Everyone on the island was watching you. The anti-aircraft gunners couldn't wait for you to fly to the island to expose the enemy to their guns. Everyone was ready to fire and just waiting, hoping you'd break through. How did you do that?" he asked in amazement. A mechanic ran up, saluted and shouted, "Your airplane. It can't be. I don't believe it. There's not a single hole in it." I couldn't believe it either. Then I scrutinized the entire Zero from bark to tail. The mechanic was right. Not a single bullet had hit the fighter. Later, already in the barracks, I learned that the first group of Zeros that flew above the clouds had a much easier fight than ours. A large group of Hellcats jumped out of the cloud right under their noses, and they gained a big advantage by suddenly swooping down on the American pilots, who never realized what was happening. Marine pilot First Class Kinsuke Muto, star of the Yokosuka Air Regiment, distinguished himself by shooting down 4 Hellcats. Other pilots confirmed his victories. Muto set 2 American fighters on fire earlier than they began maneuvering. But on this day we also suffered high casualties. About 40 fighters were shot down, almost half of what we had.